How many babies is enough via one person? I'm going to say that the person who had 26 children is having 25 too many, maybe 24. I don't want to tell you anymore because it might ruin the surprise, so just keep listening.
There's really no other way of saying this. Charles Vance Millar was a troll, someone who does fuck with people's emotions, fucks with their mind, maybe causes a little bit of disturbance, disturber of the peace, definitely. And look,
a ructionizer.
Yes.
What was it? Charles Vance Puntz?
Charles Vance Millar.
Miller's not a hard name to remember. You think I'd do better?
You'd think. But I'm just going to go out on a limb here.
Yeah.
He might be the greatest troll ever. Born in Aylmer, Ontario in 1854. And a quick note here. Canadians, I'm fucking sorry for my pronunciationification of all of your country.
Because they're the nicest people in the world, allegedly. Maybe what happened was...
Except for this guy.
That's what I mean. They put it all into one member. Like each generation, a Canadian is born and they get all the troll and shitty personality bits.
It's possible.
Excellent.
There's a couple in here that might be in there. Anyway, Aylmer, Ontario, 1854. Charles Millar was the only child of the farmers Simon and Sarah Millar. He was a smart kid. He went to the University of Toronto, where he studied law and got an average grade of 98% in all of his subjects.
In law. It's very high.
98% high. He passed the bar exam in 1884, so he's 30 there, and opened up his own law office in Toronto, where he practiced corporate and contract law. But he made all his real money turning his lawyering skills to investing in companies and real estate.
This is going to go really well. I've got a good feeling.
What?
I've got a great feeling about this guy.
Okay, so in 1905, for example, this is just showing he made money. He bought an interest in a silver mine in Cobalt, Ontario, which soon after hit a long 14-inch wide strip of silver, like just this long chunk of silver. The strip of silver became known as the Silver Sidewalk. Not the most creative, but and it made him a wealthy man.
Sure.
Another time, he got really angry at the ferry that was going to take him over to Detroit. Canada to America.
Angry with the boat.
Yeah, it was late. Well, angry with the boat driver guy.
Okay.
Or lady. He got angry and then invested $2 in the franchise that was talking about building a tunnel. There were some people around saying, hey, we should build a tunnel to America.
I'll give you $2.
And he gave him $2. Eventually that $2 turned into $100,000 later. But
Eventually,
yeah. He bought some other companies. He bought like a shipping company, the British Columbia Express Company. They started with ponies, then they had trains. They went ponies to trains.
Nice.
He became president and part owner of O'Keefe's Brewery in 1913.
O'Keefe's? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a famous Toronto brewery. He had a bunch of racehorses too, including...
you know, when some dude gets really rich, it's like, and he bought racehorses and you're like, this story's going to turn.
Oh no,
the story's going. Even if I didn't know it would anyway, this story's going to turn.
But I think it's clearly set, and he's a guy that he's making money, but he's like, what do I like? I like breweries and I like the races, and I'm gonna do that.
I like drunk horse riding.
There's a huge streak of doing what he wants in Charles Vance Millar.
Could have bought draft horses to pull the beer.
Maybe he did in the British Columbia Express Company.
Exactly.
Anyway, one of his racehorses was a good racehorse. It won the King's Plate, which is the #1 Canadian race. It's like the Melbourne Cup of Canada.
Of Canadians.
Yeah. Anyway, throughout his life, as I said, as a troll, he loved doing practical jokes. Now, I've got only a few examples at the start, and then I'll get to some good ones. But like one of his examples was he liked to drop money on the pavement. This sounds actually weirdly nice, maybe. He liked to drop money on the pavement and wait for people to pick it up. And he just got,
and then just go,
he got joy out of his face. Okay, it's not the best practical
Look
joke.
at those idiots. They picked up money they found. I'd be prepared to be fooled by that every time.
Yeah, and I've heard, there was I knew friends of mine that used to glue money to the ground.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, that's slightly more asshole, but kind of funny as well.
Depends if you like gluing a $50 bill or.
I did try and read into this, and I think there's also those people that put money on a fishing line sort of thing, and I don't know if he was doing that.
I don't think that ever happened except in cartoons.
Okay, this next thing is not him doing a practical joke. I just had to put it in here because it says a bit about his character. He used to sleep on the veranda outside his house in Toronto in all weather to keep himself hard. Well, yeah, tough, I think. Anyway, I don't know why.
You hear it your way.
It's just one of the bits of stories I thought. I think cantankerous, does what he wants, has a bit of fun.
I aspire.
After he was jilted by a girlfriend while he was at uni, he never found love. And he never married. And so when he walked the 3 flights of stairs in his office on Halloween night in 1926, apparently he's deep in the middle of a legal argument, he had no living relatives, but a fortune worth about $5 million in today's money. And he collapsed. It seemed like it was a heart attack or a stroke, and he died before the doctors could come. In the days after, there were several small and laudatory obituaries in the newspapers in Toronto. They're saying good things about him. But a few days later, still, more articles started appearing, noting the curious nature of Millar's will. I'll read a little bit from the start.
Be happy now.
So this is the start. The wording on this and the following initialized pages is the will of me, Charles Millar. That's just legal Turk. You've got to get that in.
Okay.
Made at Toronto this 7th June 1921. This will is necessarily uncommon and capricious because I have no dependents or near relations and no duty rests upon me to leave any property at my death. And what I do leave is proof of my folly in gathering and retaining more money than I required.
Capricious is an interesting way to lead off. This is going to be a shitty one. Are you ready?
So there's a few clauses, and I'll just draw your highlights to a few, and then we'll get. So a small start. For one of the ones, he left a chunk of his money, not heaps, but enough, to an old housekeeper who was already dead, which
sweet.
And she died long before 1921. He's just like, this.
Let's see what you guys do with it. Oh, wait, I won't be here. Okay.
He left money for prayers to be said for the soul of a Protestant acquaintance of his by the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Toronto.
It's like, I'm a Catholic, but it is money.
Charles Millar quite enjoyed being Catholic and teasing Protestants. I think that was a big part of his feeling here.
That's fun.
Because in the next one, he left a huge chunk of his Catholic brewery. That's O'Keefe's. Well, it was, I believe, Irish people ran it. And
politically Catholic.
All the people that, yeah, probably. And they probably associated, like a lot of the people associated with the Catholic Church there.
Right.
But anyway, he left a huge chunk of his Catholic brewery, O'Keefe's, to a bunch of prominent Protestant ministers and temperance advocates.
I'm really liking this guy. Go Millar.
He left $25,000 worth of Ontario Jockey Club stock, so race club, to fervent anti-racing advocates.
Perfect.
And this one is fun. He had a beach house down in Jamaica, and he left that to 3 lawyers that he knew hated each other.
Oh yeah.
And it was very much, when you die, you can't pass it on to anyone. It's going to the city. So you have to have this while you're alive and fight over.
Can't sell it. You can't pass. Could they sell it?
No, couldn't sell it. It would just go. It reverts back to the
immediately. Excellent. Okay. I may regret this, but this guy's, he's all right.
I thought he might inspire.
I love the shit stirring. When being such a jerk in your will, you're like, I won't even see any of this.
He must have. You just imagine him writing this will and chuckling to himself, just like
a movie villain.
Yeah, totally.
That's great.
But the real kicker was something that it went relatively unnoticed in the first reporting of the will. I'll read it out, and there's a bunch of lawyer terms, but you should be able to hear.
Okay.
All the rest and residue of my property, wheresoever situate I give.
Wherever it is.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Devise and bequest onto my executors and trustees named below in trust to convert into money as they deem advisable and invest all the money until the expiration of 9 years from my death, and then call in and convert it all into money and the expiration of 10 years from my death to give it and its accumulations to the mother who has since my death given birth in Toronto to the greatest number of children as shown by registrations under the Vital Statistics Act.
Get down.
If one or more mothers have equal highest number of registrations under the said act, to divide the monies and accumulations equally between them.
Oh, let the fucking begin. That's insane.
And this begins the Great Stork Derby. Welcome to The Wholesome Show.
A podcast that wants to make a baby with the whole of science.
Yeah.
We do.
We
want to breed with you, science.
The Wholesome Show is me, Will Grant.
And me, Roderick G. Lamberts.
How do you feel about writing your will?
I've never been so interested. I mean, unfortunately, of course, if I die first, it could be a bit,
Yeah,
shitty.
sure.
But holy fuck.
Significant other.
Put in some fucking troll clauses is an excellent idea. Like, really.
I totally
like
get the idea of this bachelor, lifelong committed bachelor.
Yeah.
Don't have any near relatives
Yeah.
and just saying, you know what? I want to muck some rake. I am going to see what
Yeah.
happens with this.
But the only bummer is, in a way, is he could write it himself, so he didn't have other people like reading it and notarizing it.
That's true.
Going,
Surely it has to be witnessed.
I don't know.
Lawyers? I don't know.
Look,
Put it in the comments. I don't
I nearly have a will, so I can almost tell you.
really.
We're so close.
You've got dogs.
Yeah.
You need to say what happens to them.
They fend for themselves. They sleep outside in
They
the
would
weather.
eat your body. Like
And they should. Take this, for it is my flesh. No, literally.
my dog is not tough enough to eat my body.
How hungry is she?
Yeah, maybe.
Ours aren't tough, but they like food.
Yeah. Okay. Just a quick note on sources. There's a bunch out there on this topic. A lot of them are worth reading, but there is one that is head and shoulders above all the others. And it's a shout out to a master's dissertation. This is Elizabeth Marjorie Wilton's master's thesis, Bearing the Burden, the Great Toronto Stork Derby, 1926 to 1938.
Stork Derby.
Nothing really happened with Millar's weird contest for a few years.
Right.
There are a few disputes around the will. The first one, there was, I think, the Roman Catholic Archbishop who had to say the prayers. Either he protested or someone protested, and they removed that clause. I think he said,
What?
I don't know. Maybe I don't take money for prayer. I'll say a prayer.
Oh, for the prayer.
I'll
not
say
for,
a prayer, but
yeah.
So
Yeah, it's above my morals. As a member of the Catholic Church, we don't like to accumulate will.
There were certainly, as we'll come back to this, a few family members, distant relatives who are like, I'd be thinking I'd be having some of that money.
What do you know? They pop up suddenly.
It's
I mean,
weird.
hard
It's
to believe.
weird. And, the term half aunt came up, and I had never seen the term half aunt before.
There is no half aunt.
1926 rolled around, then 1928, then 1929. But in 1930, things started to change.
So how many years out are we from?
So 1926, Halloween.
26. So
Halloween
when the will kicks
1926
off?
is the death, and Halloween 1936 is the finish line.
So interesting to try and time your run.
Time you run. The point about a marathon is you just got to keep going. You can't go, I'm going to save my run and get 19 babies in the last year.
What is it? Dudeca tuplets run in my family. I'm going to bargain on a litter in
First,
the ninth
I'm
year.
going to prep my body enough that I can have the dudeca tuplets in the last year.
You really, literally, if the moment you hear about it, you're like, we're having a kid. Could you adopt them?
The mother who has since given birth in Toronto. So you got to give birth.
Look at me, looking for loopholes, failing.
Look,
Okay.
So of course, it's a large sum of cash. And as you approach a finish line, of course, people start paying more attention. But I think something else changed here. And it's the Depression, the Great Depression. So 1929, stock market crash, everyone loses their job, or nearly everyone. And so everyone starts getting a lot more interested in money. And so perhaps, and this is what Elizabeth Wilton suggests, maybe this had a bit of a catalyst in turning people more towards this competition.
So it was well publicized? Are you going to get to that?
Not for 4 years. So the first 4 years, nothing. Like it was basically no one talked about this. And the first real article about the Great Stork Derby, it wasn't quite called that yet. But anyway, 4 years into the competition. So October 1930, Gordon Sinclair, one of Toronto Daily Star's most popular reporters.
Oh, yeah, everyone knows that.
Took the innovative step of going to find mothers of large families who might be interested in winning a giant pile of cash. I don't know how Gordon Sinclair got the idea of the story. There was reporting around the will because it was weird. And everyone was like, this is a funny will. Yeah. And maybe at some point he thought, let's go and look at large families. So in the quest, he discovered Mrs. Bagnato, the mother of 20 children, and Mrs. Brown, the mother of 26 children with 13 living.
Well, there's one fight.
Okay. The article focused on
26. So she started when she was 3 and had quadruplets.
I don't have all of the ages for all of the mothers here, but there are definitely some people in this story who have a bagload of kids at they're basically the equivalent of first years at university. And I'm like,
what's left of your body? What's left of your body when you've incubated 26 people?
Look, this is one of the other components of this story. People became really quite conflicted and horrified about what this was doing to the women involved. And we all look, I didn't actually look up the science on this because we know. Like it's
great.
I think you just ask mothers and you go, what's the toll of a pregnant? And
you've had 2. Have you thought of 24 more?
Indeed. And so, yeah.
Well, the first 2 have been a delight. Why wouldn't the next 24 be? The next
it gets
2
easier.
dozen. I'd just you'd be ravaged. You'd just be a sack of goo with teats. I mean, you would. Anyways, come on. Even the fittest young lady, 26 babies.
I admit that it would be a challenge. So the article focused on a discussion with Mr. and Mrs. Brown as they were seen as the challengers to Mrs. Bagnato, who had just given birth to her 20th child, 5 of whom were eligible for the Miller money. So they were very clear it had to be born within the certain period. So she was up to 20, but 5 were eligible children within the window.
So you needed the highest number, and then there was a subcategory.
No, it's just the highest number in that 10 years. So there's 10 years between Halloween and Halloween, and it's got to, you can
so
have
if you had 40 kids before,
doesn't count.
I can imagine that. Cross your legs, sweetheart. This one's got to count. And it's the 31st.
There's a little bit of that.
I'm surprised.
This article uncovers a bunch of the themes that come through. And just a quick note, that was a delicious beer. Like
Moretti La Rosa.
Mrs. Brown claimed 6 of her children had been born since Miller's death. Mrs. Brown, this is only 4 years later, so that's getting the runs on. In asserting
6 in 4 years.
6 in 4 years.
Okay. Some would say 6 full stop is a lot.
Indeed. Mrs. Brown, in asserting her right to the money, proclaimed, "I can't let any Italian get away with that leadership stuff." I don't know if that's the Canadian.
So is it spelled Italian?
I don't know if that's the Canadian version, but the Australian racist would have done it that way.
Eyetay.
I'm a Canadian and so is my husband. We're honest to gosh, dyed-in-the-wool, native-born Canadians of the 5th generation and think 6 babies in 5 years ought to lead. Mr. Brown added to his wife's comments saying, if a few more Canadians would be themselves and produce a decent-sized family, the country would not be overrun by foreigners. I don't know why he turned Australian there.
But because many have spoken that way in our fair nation. That is so classic. It sounds like a bad satire.
Yes. Look, you may be surprised, but the 1930s were not low on racism.
Really?
And so everything in this is just, can we interpret this through a racist prism? Then let's do it.
Yes, we can. Hold my beer. Okay.
So articles in this sort of light continued for the next few years, but interviewing mothers as if it was a race. But people weren't really paying much attention. It needed something else to turn up the heat.
Yes.
In 1932, the Ontario government, Attorney General William Price, stepped in to crack down on the silliness and introduced a bill to escheat the estate.
Escheat?
I had never heard the term, legal term for nicking the cash. So the government is just saying, all right, that's ours. We'll give it to the University of Toronto. Earlier on, Miller had said, give my money to the University of Toronto, but that was superseded by the will.
And after a small handling fee for the officers concerned.
Generally, he was saying, I mean, there were 3 arguments that he was raising, or that were being raised in defense of nicking the cash.
Yeah.
The first was, and this is probably legit, the will conveyed the estate on hazardous principle, and because it was not along the lines of public policy. So, you can't say you get my money if you ride a motorbike.
Cut a finger off every 10 minutes.
Yes, that. I was going to say ride a motorbike into like one of those crushing jaws of death. Like you can't do that.
Can't do that.
So perhaps fair enough.
Yeah, okay.
Other people said that it would be too difficult to determine the winner of the baby marathon.
So you take the people who want to compete and you keep them in the same building.
I like the idea that it would be too difficult to count the babies. Like there would be no possible way.
We're like
knowing.
1, 2. I've lost count again.
How could we know?
Put them out to the other side of the room again.
Oh.
Well, don't you? You cut them in half and count the rings.
That doesn't.
So you know how old they are.
Exactly. It doesn't count the number. Toronto Daily Star wrote that the government felt that as the will applied not merely to married women but to any mother, it held out the door to fraud and all sorts of collusion agreements was left wide open and that costly litigation may inevitably ensue.
When did parental testing to prove, was that blood test based back then? Did they do it at all?
This is mothers. We're not testing that the fathers necessarily are.
But if they didn't see the baby coming out of said mother.
I think usually someone does. Often.
So you have to bring your obstetrician to the final interview.
Yes. When babies are certified, there is a little bit of a trust process where we say,
can you prove this came out of you? No, sir.
Okay.
But he can.
And finally, there were other people saying they wanted to stop the money from going to an American. And that was the...
good call.
Yeah, that was the long-lost relatives who are just...
the half-aunts.
Yeah. when the government introduced the bill, it kicked off a whole bunch of hornets' nests.
Yeah.
On one side, they pissed off rich people, and they're like, rich people don't like the idea of the government interfering with wills.
Not the poor's getting money.
Yeah,
they don't like that.
They didn't
either,
like
but-
that. They
yeah.
didn't like that. But the idea that suddenly the government could say, no, your money goes to the University of Toronto, no matter what.
That was not your wishes.
Whether you left it to your children or to
Someone's badger.
Mr. Seguin. And in fact, there's all of the members of Parliament nearly said the same thing. Conservative members suggested that sheeting the estate could institute a dangerous precedent in which we are destroying the principle of wills and similar documents. All men have the right to make wills, no matter how funny or curious that will may seem.
Within the parameters of, what is it? Duodecimal harm.
I think it was very much, this is striking at the very basis of having property. So people didn't like that, but it's also pissed off a bunch of women in Toronto. While we will come to women's opinions on the competition later, and
If we have time, obviously.
people changed opinion on this. They're all like, if people are competing, then they should have the right to win. And anyway,
It's a strange way to compete for anything.
oh my God. So the Globe reported at the time, womanhood indignant, outspoken womanhood asserted itself in the political arena yesterday.
Oh dear.
And there were speedy upsetting happenings. There was no dramatic invasion of the legislature halls by femininity, but the women made themselves heard in the homes, over the telephones, on the streets, in the stores, and elsewhere.
Did they now?
They talked emphatically and persistently, and the town seethed with their sizzling comment.
Feeder, the fiddling comment?
It was indubitably the accumulation of indignation among women. This is the most overwritten article.
Christ.
Among women, which forced this volte-face on the part of the Attorney General.
Oh, I almost wish I didn't speak English after hearing that. Like, I don't even want to understand.
They were the quickest and most vehement to resent the implications of the bill.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, the
Womanhood were.
womanhood were. Womanhood and rich people. Some overlap.
Not often.
But yeah.
Not
so
then.
I think the rich men were like, I want to write my will, and if I want to write dumb stuff in my will, I should be able to do it.
Yeah.
And women were like, if I want to compete to have the most babies, then I should be able to do that.
You got to love, I mean, I don't know how it ended, but the idea that you've got like a 12-way tie and everyone's sitting there gasping and wheezing. They've just had 10 to 15 children in 10 years. And like, yay, I won $400. It was all worth it.
So the government dropped the bill pretty quick. But amidst this whole fight over the legislation, a bunch of the newspapers were like, oh, there's a bit more interest in this story than we thought. And they started to pick up a lot more of the race dynamic. They started interviewing mothers a lot. They found all the contending families.
Oh, as in horse race. I'm thinking like, and now it's getting racist? Like, holy shit.
No, it started racist. It continues racist throughout, but horse racing, yes.
Right, yeah.
And so it's going around finding all the different contenders and every baby, every death, everything. They're gonna find out what's going on. And suddenly everyone in Toronto is like watching the Great Stork Derby.
Well, you would. I mean, if it happened here, you totally would. Except there'd be a Netflix miniseries, etc. You wouldn't have to go.
There is a bad Canadian show on this. Over the next few years, as it's approaching that Halloween 1936 deadline, the newspapers turned the whole thing into this circus.
Yeah.
Each newspaper is desperate to get scoops from contending families. There's a whole bunch of reporters hiding in bushes. There's
just because it's got nothing to do with the story.
Yeah. there's some families signing exclusive deals with particular reporters. There's one story where one family signed an exclusive deal with one newspaper, and then another newspaper tried to get it, and then like the husband beat up the guy from the other newspaper because and it's just like
that's how you get out of those contracts.
Yeah. It got pretty big attention.
But it's a smart way to go, because that way you're hedging your bets there, and you go like, we might not win, but watch us try. And then you know what you do? You don't really try, but you make it look like you're trying, and then you get the exclusive money.
Look, this is the interesting thing that throughout, and this is what you'd have to do, is like, absolutely, there were people that were having a lot of kids beforehand, before they really knew it was a competition. Clearly, some of these women. What did you say before? There's 26 women, of which 4 of them counted, and
26 babies.
I don't know, something like that. There are families having big families.
Yeah.
But there was as it becomes this sort of race dynamic, a lot of people start talking more about, oh no, we just love having children, and really stressing that point. And so, because you don't want to be caught saying, I'm having this baby to win a competition, and it's like, oh.
Yeah, or, own it.
Yeah, maybe. Got reported all over the place. Like, there's definitely articles you can find in Australia on this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, all over the world. Definitely.
Okay.
So the mothers were the center of this, finding all about delving into private lives. The mothers are interviewed and telling stories about their child rearing and housekeeping abilities, hopes and aspirations. And you can imagine families were subject to a fair bit of judgment.
Really?
This. Now, yeah. Now we can talk about the underlying dynamics of the coverage in a little bit. But let's look at some of the families. And you can sort of guess at some of the patterns going on here.
I don't want to. It'll make me sound like a bad person.
Now, these, of course, weren't all the families, but I think it's most of the families, because towards the end, I think it was around August 1936, maybe even before, they started having events for all of the families, where they're like picnics, and so they'd have whatever it is, 8, 9 families there, and there's literally hundreds of kids. Like, it's shocking numbers of kids.
Fucking hell.
So there's the Bagnato family, and that's the one that we spoke of before. Mrs. Bagnato was one of the first identified competitors. So at the time of the 1930 article, that was the first article, she already had 20 children, 10 of whom were living. She was born in Canada of Italian immigrants.
Really?
Yes, indeed. Grace's husband immigrated to Canada to marry her by arrangement. Grace was 12 years old at the time.
Her cousin came to marry his 12-year-old cousin.
Yes.
Sweet.
The Bagnatos were Roman Catholics. She worked as a court interpreter in Toronto, and the papers most often referred to her as the still comely mother of 24 children.
Oh, it's okay. She's still kind of pretty.
There was a portrait of the family done in the Toronto Star in 1936. The report,
in panorama mode?
Yeah.
Myriad. How would you describe your family? Myriad children.
The reporter described the activity level in the home as amazing, with 13 of the 18 children. And I think amazing is a nice positive term. Like, I would be amazed at any house that has 13 children. Mrs. Bagnato not only prepared all the meals, but worked full-time as a court interpreter. She drove a car and in her spare time acted as a legal advisor within the Italian community. The Bagnato family was the only home of all the Stork Derby contenders to possess a phone.
Oh, wow. Oh, but we're nearly not even 1930, aren't we?
By August 1936, so this is the end of the competition, Mrs. Bagnato had given birth to 23 children and was expecting her 24th. 9 of the children had been born within the magic period.
Wow.
Next, the Graziano family.
Oh, fuck me.
Hilda and Gus Graziano had 10 children by 1936, 7 of whom were considered eligible for the competition. An 8th child had been stillborn in 1929, so in the period, and was unregistered. And a 9th eligible child died shortly after birth.
Well, can we get a judge's ruling here? I don't want to.
Mr. Graziano had emigrated to Canada from Italy, and Mrs. Graziano was of French-Canadian extraction. They lived in a slum alley in Toronto.
Nice. They
were Roman Catholics. In 1936, Mr. Graziano had been unemployed for 4 years. He'd previously worked as a market gardener. One of their children was named Benito Mussolini Graziano.
Coincidence, right?
I think so.
You imagine them looking in the poem and going, "You're not going to believe this. There's this other guy. Wow. I'm as shocked as you."
The Timleck family. They had 17 children, 13 of whom were living in 1936, and 10 of whom were considered eligible for the competition. She was born in Ireland and came to Ontario as an orphan.
But if she had, was it 13, 10 eligible?
Yeah.
But someone who had 40 children and 7 eligible would beat her because they had a bigger family first?
No. Got to have the most babies in that window.
No matter how many you had before?
No matter how many you had before.
Okay, I misunderstood.
They count for nothing.
Okay.
They count for nothing.
Just checking.
Mr. Timleck was born in Saskatchewan. They were living in a house on River Street, poor part of town. Mr. Timleck had worked as a mechanic with the City Parks Department for the past 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So super wealthy, they can afford heaps of kids, all of them.
The Nagle family. The Nagles were both from Ontario, devout Roman Catholics of Irish extraction. They had 12 living children and 2 others that had died. 9 of their children were eligible for the competition. In 1936, Mr. Nagle had not had steady work for 3 years. Just the other thing is so many of these stories of, it's the Depression, so it doesn't make unemployment better, but it's just horrifying lengths of long-term unemployment and looking around and just going, there is no work.
So even better, they're Roman Catholics, so contraception is completely evil. They got nothing better to do all day.
I'll come back to that one. So Mrs. Nagle had studied diet in the hospital where she worked before she was married and was 31 years old in 1936. So that's with the 12 plus 2 others. So they lived in a small house in Leonard Street.
Of course they did. Rich people don't have 100 children.
Mrs. Nagle also said if she were to win the money, she would see the other contenders got some money.
Oh, that's what you're supposed to say. Win the crowd.
Well, there is a nice story where, as it started out, there was a lot of trash talking Whatever, we deserve this.
Yeah.
But it seems pretty clear that towards the later stages of the competition, most of the families were like, okay, this is rough. The only way we can cope with this weird situation is that we all actually become friends. And I think most of them did, not all of them, but a lot of them were like, whoever wins. It's not like the real winner is child babies. But it was very much let's just like a lot of sports people will get a good camaraderie with the people they're competing against.
Sure.
Yeah.
Different sports.
Mrs. Kenny, perhaps described by Wilton as perhaps the most colourful of all the Stork Derby contestants.
Colourful?
Yeah, she appeared in the newspapers in the autumn of 1934, and after that time was a constant focus for media attention.
Cool.
Both of the Kenny parents were born in Toronto. She of French-Canadian extraction, he of Irish descent, staunchly Catholic.
Yep.
Mrs. Kenny was the mother of 16 children, of whom 11 were living by 1936.
Damn.
There was a great deal of confusion of how many of her children were actually eligible for the competition.
Oh.
She was convinced throughout that she'd be the sole winner. She said that she had a divine connection with Charles Miller, and that he assured her she would win. This is from Beyond the Grave.
Of course.
She carved a whole bunch of large wooden statues of Charlie Miller and of public dignitaries and a replica of the hospital where she gave birth.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of other horrible stories here that Mrs. Kenny is one of them, but there's another house like living in terrible conditions.
Yeah.
And there's one house that's children suffering rat bites and just overrun with rats. One of Mrs. Kenny's children died.
Of rats?
Yes.
Look, if they were living on farms and stuff, then breeding your workforce for a long time made sense.
Yeah.
For millennia made sense. This is living in slums in city, does not make sense.
The MacLeans entered the competition at the last minute on the last day, October, the surprise entrance. Suddenly people are like, whoa, there's another family. They had appeared in the start of the same year, but shielded their identity, calling themselves Mr. and Mrs. A. Both parents were of Scottish descent, which was received favourably by the newspapers.
What's it now?
A Star reporter actually called their home to ask them if they were going to register for the competition. Mrs. A had said that she'd been following the competition, but could not get her husband interested. She had 9 children, all of whom were alive and properly registered.
Interested in what sense?
I don't know. He seems to be interested.
Sweetheart. Yeah.
The article gave a glowing assessment. Emphasis was placed on their Scottish thrift and belief in the importance of education.
Infamous.
They were both Protestant. The reporter was equally impressed by their home. Their home had polished furniture and lovely, colourful rugs.
And all materials were tartan.
Well, maybe. In the living room is a veloured-coloured Chesterfield, several comfortable, easy chairs, tables with floor lamps near them, a piano, and interesting pictures around the walls.
Fancy bastards.
The room breathed a pleasant air of moderate prosperity and thrift.
Oh.
The MacLeans expressed that they were anxious to avoid publicity, and they certainly gave no thought to the Miller will when having their children. They only entered it because others with fewer children thought they deserved it. They just wanted to correct the record, is basically what they're doing.
Good citizens, unmotivated by money. Well, they're thrifty.
Yeah.
They're not greedy.
Yeah. The Smith are another last-minute entry. They entered on October 21st, 1936. They had 9, all of whom were living and properly registered in Toronto.
Okay.
Mrs. Smith claimed that she had not followed the story at all and didn't know the names of any of the other contestants. He was a fireman, born in England. He'd fought for Canada in World War I. The family was Protestant.
I know we're small, but whenever people talk about Canadian military operations and their participation stuff, I'm like, that's right, they have an army. I just don't think of Canada as having a military.
Sure.
Just Mounties.
They need to.
In my head, they only have Mounties.
I kind of feel like if you had like 1 million Mounties, that would be. There's this terrible YouTube channel.
Really?
It's yeah, I know, like, and it does like all computer generated fights between, pick 2. You'll get 400 gladiators versus
Woody Allen.
They would win versus 7,000 werewolves. Or some sort of version of that, and they put them, and it's just like computer generated, and they just fight until there's one person left, and it's kind of dumbly compelling.
I want to watch it now. Let's push pause.
I want Mounties. I want Mounties versus whatever.
Anything. So he fought in a war, even though Canada doesn't have an army, they only have Mounties.
Yeah, only Mounties. And the newspapers again said it's a pleasure to visit the Smith home. Auburn-haired Mrs. Smith, only 31 years old, despite her record of 10 offspring, 9 born within the charmed period, is a pleasant young woman to talk to. With her good-looking, stockily built husband, they make an affable and courteous pair. They are thrifty, kindly, sensible folk. They are successful parents.
Damn, thrifty's a feature here, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, well, it's the Depression.
I know, it's just interesting. Like nowadays, The only way I've ever heard anyone's described, with their relationship to money is cheap fucker. But I've never heard thrifty as like, and they're thrifty.
No, totally.
Thrifty is just not a thing.
Yeah, not
anymore.
Mrs. Pauline Mae Clarke. She first appeared in the press as Mrs. X. She attempted to shield her identity in this manner because of the less than respectable circumstances surrounding the birth of her children. By 1936, Mrs. Clarke, at the age of only 24, was the mother of 10 children. She was discovered by the Telegram in August.
24.
Yes.
Cool.
She was discovered by the Telegram in August 1936 and pleaded with them to keep her identity secret because 5 of her 10 children had been born after she had separated from her husband. She said that she would have married the second man, but didn't have enough money to secure a proper divorce. And look, it may also be in a time when there isn't a no-fault divorce type thing. Like you got to demonstrate, get fucked,
pay to not be with someone.
Exactly. That just get fucked. If 2 people want a divorce,
that's
a
enough.
Divorce. They're divorced.
Yeah.
Like
you need just cause. We don't want to be together anymore. Tick.
She was not aware of the competition until the birth of her twins in July 1936, right near the end,
Yep.
when the doctor asked her jokingly if she was trying to beat Mrs. Kenny. So how did it end? Halloween 1936 arrived.
Badly.
17 mothers and 32 lawyers stepped forward to claim the prize.
32 lawyers. What we need is at least 2 lawyers per mother just to be safe. That's excellent.
And the fortune had grown in this time. I mean, it was meant to be invested, but
only for 9 years though.
So the $2 in the tunnel money, that turned out to be $100,000 in Canadian money at the time. So a lot of money. So basically $2.5 million.
So this tunnel exists?
Yeah, it's the only international tunnel that you can drive through. Roughly 5 million. The numbers don't matter that much originally in today's money. Now it's about 10 million in today's money. So it's a packet of cash that you can look after your lots of kids with.
Your litters.
And of course, with 32 lawyers, it ends up in court.
Really?
And it's Canada's biggest legal case of the 1930s. It dragged on for 2 years, between 1936 to 1938. Got to the Supreme Court. It went all the way through every level.
And let me guess, at the very end, the lawyers got 9.73 million of it, and the pocket change was left to be split among the winners.
You are so cynical.
Yes.
So there are 3 issues to discuss.
Yep.
First, Justice Middleton. He's the presiding judge on this. He said, okay, first, too many lawyers. You have
30's my max.
No, he went down to 6.
6?
So he kicked 26 lawyers off the case and said, we're going to do this with 6 lawyers.
How many people were the lawyers representing in theory? How many parties?
Well, 17 mothers plus also the distant relatives, at least. In the lead up to this, when I said that the families became sort of friendly, a bunch of the families said, hey, let's just agree and split the cash. Like, let's just go, we're all up the front. And the lawyers arguing against that. Arguing that an arrangement of this sort could invalidate the whole will. A source close to the executors of the will, according to the newspapers, compared the Derby to a horse race, saying, what would happen if the horse race owners got together before a race and decided to split the purse?
Nothing.
Not quite the same.
No.
Not quite the same at all.
Yeah, you won, but we're all getting the money. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, anyway, the lawyers said, no, we want some of our cash.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's issue 1, too many lawyers. Right. Next issue was the validity of the will. This took a few months to resolve.
I'd put that up top.
Yeah, okay. The first one wasn't. I just like the idea that he kicked off all the lawyers.
In no significant. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, Wilton just said there were 2 issues. I just liked kicking off.
That is an issue.
The distant Millar relatives, so these are the half aunt, popped up again saying the will should be declared invalid because it was against the public good, and also we want the money.
And you can take out the first bit.
But they wanted some sort of an argument.
Is a public good? Why? I don't know.
They said it was contrary to the public good because it promoted immoral behavior. Anyway, that case actually, like that component of the case, Supreme Court of Ontario Supreme Court of Appeal, and eventually Supreme Court of Canada, where it was declared valid. Like, it's like, you're done. The will stands. The will is good.
Oh, it was not the argument. Okay. Right.
Yeah. The argument's no good. The will is valid. So that's the second. So now we're down to the end point of the race. We know we get an end of the race.
Yeah.
They said that even though it wasn't in the public good, upholding a will is probably more important than that. So,
okay.
Final question: who won? Who had the most babies? Which babies were valid? As Wilton writes, in November 1936, when the claimants stepped forward, it was clear the division of money wouldn't be easy. There were 3 conditions.
That's a keen legal mind right there. That's not going to be easy. Mm-hmm. Three conditions.
First, the children to be eligible had to be registered under the Vital Statistics Act, and not all of them were. Therefore, had to be decided if late registration would be allowed.
Okay.
A further question, fuck me, was whether stillborn children were to be included in the count.
Look, it's gross, but I'm not surprised
Yeah, I know.
because if the original provision was gave birth to.
And then there was the issue of legitimacy. As Wilton says, Judge Middleton stuck closely to rigid rules of middle-class decorum and traditional legal precedent in rendering his decisions. So I didn't mention Mrs. Meldrum before, but she had a lot of rats in her house.
Oh, yeah.
Had given birth to 9 children in the allowed time, but 2 had been born in York County. Although the parents lived in Toronto, Middleton kicked them out. No good. Two of your babies were born in a different hospital. So
when he's sitting in a position where he's got to go, fuck, I've got to make a call somehow.
In slight defense
what's
to him,
defensible?
He's got to start kicking out something. I don't know.
Or he could have just said, yeah, you can all have it. Then there would have been, the brawls would not end until they found a judge who actually made a call, sure.
Oh my God. I don't know if I would like to preside on this because it's pretty horrendous.
I don't want to preside on anything. I think it would be horrifying.
I'm not a presiding kind of guy. Unless you can podcast about it. Another mother, Mrs. Carter, had given birth to 9 children, but 1 child had been born just prior to the opening date of the competition, so she too was ruled out.
Okay, well
fair enough.
That's fair. That's simple rules. Yep.
Several other mothers who had given birth to 6 to 8 children hopefully put forth a claim for the money, but were met with complete dismissal. Mrs. Thomas Mays, a thin, clear-spoken woman who had a back seat, said, "I am the mother of 12 children, and 6 of them were born in the last 10 years."
I'm also thin and clear-spoken.
Well, yes. I'm afraid 6 isn't enough to qualify, the justice commented. "Well, I just thought I'd try," said Mrs. Mays. You never can tell about these things, which fair. I mean, if you haven't been following the reporting and you're like, I feel like I've got a lot, I'd like to know.
I just had a baby. Does that work? No.
So let's go with some of the others we introduced before.
Yeah.
Pauline Mae Clarke. She had 11 children. 1 had been born outside city limits, so that one didn't count. And only half of them, so she was down to 10.
Down to.
Well, only half of them had been born legitimate children with her legitimate husband. So now she's down to 5. Sorry, Paul.
Was that specified in the will, though? There must be within the bounds of propriety.
No, that wasn't.
That was arbitrary.
That was not specified in the will.
Completely arbitrary.
We can go back to that. It did say born in Toronto in that period and registered with the Vital Statistics Act.
Okay.
But it didn't say anything about legitimate or not.
Yeah, okay, so irrelevant, but I'm not the judge.
Sorry, Pauline. The Bagnatos. Well, they had 9 children in the magic period and another 14 before that. But sadly, 2 of their children weren't registered. So it feels more like 7 rather than 9. So no money for them.
Not registered. The bureaucrats always get their win in the end, don't they?
Oh, my God.
No. We don't have a Filofax card in the bottom of the drawer.
You know, that baby came out of her. She suffered through all of that, and they're like, not in the file.
Do you agree that happened? Yes, we do. Can we count it? No.
I would be a little bit furious.
Can we retrospectively fill in the card? No. Why not? Because that's not the rules.
And I think in some sense, possibly most furious for Pauline Mae Clarke. I get she's got 11 children in the period. 1 born outside the city limits. I'm like, okay. But she's got 10. Yeah. 10, come back to that number in a bit.
Okay.
Anyway, the Bagnatos had 9. 2 didn't count because
so that's 7.
The Grazianos. In 1936, they had 9 children in the magic period, but 2 had died shortly before or after birth. So maybe more like 7 if you're an arsehole.
Died after still.
After.
Okay.
So
how long after?
One was a stillbirth, and I don't have the numbers. I think it was in the hours.
But I'm thinking about that question. Okay, no. Stillborn doesn't count. What if they died an hour after? No. What if they died a year after?
It's fucked. They didn't get any money.
Messed up.
So the Timlecks, they had 10 children in the eligible period. They shared the prize money. The Nagles, 9 children in the eligible period. They shared the prize money. The MacLeans, 9 children in the eligible period, all nice, neat, and registered. They shared the prize money. The Smiths, 9 nice, neat children. They get the prize. Do you know, there's a pattern here that 3 Protestant families and 1 Catholic family shared in the prize money. In the end, 4 families, the Nagles, the Timlecks, the MacLeans, and the Smiths shared in the money.
But one had 10.
I know. That's the bit that baffles me.
What am
So it smells to me like 9 if you're Protestant, 10 if you're Catholic. and you get the prize.
Saying it out loud, they've been the judge going, oh, yeah, 10, but you got to share it with these others. Oh, they got 10 too? No, 9. What? How do you even do it with a straight face? You're like, yeah, no, you got to share it. Why? That's the rules.
You're all the same. It's all equal.
It's obvious. What are you talking about?
Okay. So each of those families received $100,000 in that money each. So it's roughly $2.5 million or something in Australian dollars now for their 9 or 9+ children.
So I keep thinking, like, that sounds like a great amount of money. I'd love to have that, but I don't want the 9 kids with it. Kids are beautiful. I just don't want 9 of them.
No, okay. Mrs. Pauline Clarke and the Kennys did contest the findings, and they were awarded an out-of-set. And remember, Pauline Clarke was the one that had 11 children in the time, but half were illegitimate. And they were awarded out-of-court settlement for $12,500 each.
Woo!
The government received $137,000 in succession duties, and the lawyers walked away with $25,000
each, or total.
No, total. So yeah, they did it.
It could have been worse.
It could have been worse.
As in, they didn't deserve more.
I said at the beginning of this that Charles Vance Millar was a troll. It's pretty obvious now that the whole Great Stork Derby is pretty epic, horrible, freaky. I don't know, move. But here's the thing.
Very successful though for a troll.
Well,
wow.
Here's the thing. On the 2nd of March, 1873, the US Congress passed what were called the Comstock Law, an anti-obscenity law that prohibited the dissemination of obscene material.
Yep.
And it specifically listed information about contraceptives, stuff to stop you getting pregnant, as obscene material. So feminists were arrested for sending material about birth control through the mail.
Yep.
In Canada, people like John Charlton followed the American example. Here's a quote of his from Parliament in 1892, something like that. Vile literature is secretly and widely circulated in Canada. Literature of a character calculated to undermine the morals of the people and entail the most disastrous consequences on society. Improper and obscene or semi-obscene literature is imported into this country and openly sold. And so, in Canada's first criminal code in 1892, it also criminalised both the distribution and sale of contraceptive products and the dissemination of information about them. You can't even talk about advertise. This is not the more controversial end of reproductive health. This is contraceptives. This is condoms. This is diaphragms. It's not the pill yet. They're obviously not.
But this is saying, did you know you don't have to get pregnant? Here's some ways you might not get pregnant if you have the intercourse.
Indeed.
Boom, obscene.
If the accused could not prove they were acting for the public good, and they typically couldn't, they could be sent to prison for 2 years.
Sweet. Why wouldn't you?
In 1926 and 1936, it remained illegal to disseminate information about birth control. So we don't have direct evidence that Millar was doing it for that purpose. It's well known that he thought the prohibition of not just birth control, but even the discussion of it was just absurd. And the theory is that Millar wanted to bring about a spectacular discussion of what can happen when society denies the right to birth control. In fact, one of the winning ladies, Lucy Timleck, did take a moment afterwards to tell the press, I think birth control is a wonderful thing. I'm sorry in one way that birth control information wasn't available years ago. I know mothers would have welcomed such knowledge. A variety of campaigners and doctors, including A.R. Kaufman and the absolutely heroic Elizabeth Bagshaw, Dr. Elizabeth Bagshaw. She opened up a hidden clinic doing a lot of services for women, I think in Toronto, and providing contraceptions and stuff like that, and then worked as a doctor until she was 95.
That's great, but can we get back to a doctor called Kaufman?
It took until 1969 that contraception was legalized in Canada.
It's fair to say our country ain't perfect.
No.
And actually, no, I'm not going to say anymore because I don't know where we fell on that either.
I looked it up and I don't think we had these sorts of laws. It just blows my mind that I get abortion is a much more complicated ethical issue, and I bet that there's a much more active thing going on. But the idea of contraception being illegal, it just...
I'm not talking about it.
I know.
Talking about it.
Oh, my God.
Also, though, I can't help but... I mean, I hope old Millar was actually doing that, but it also sounds like a convenient way to say actually he's not a bad guy.
No.
It was all about this instead.
I think he's a troll, an arsehole, but I do think there was a part of him that was like, we should probably like have spectacle to talk about these kinds of things a little bit. No, I'm not painting him as a goodie here. I just think
you can be a troll for good as well.
I think so.
It could be an accident or not as a byproduct, but it could still have dual purpose. dual use arguments.
Go and have whatever number of baby you want.
Whatever number of baby. Have as many a baby that you would like.
Babies, do what you like, but don't be tricked into it by a weird competition.
No, make it a really good competition. It's got to be straightforward.